Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Hello, and welcome to Our Curious Amalgam, the podcast from the American Bar Association Antitrust Law section. My name is Christina, and today's topic is the game over? Competition law implications of the Super League. In April 2021, the soccer, or as known outside of the United States, football world was in an uproar over the announcement by 12 of Europe's leading football clubs of plans for a breakaway, quote-unquote, Super League. Condemnation of the Super League was loud and resounding, and within a week, the league plans had fallen apart. Although no longer, the Super League raised interesting antitrust questions as to the legality of such a coalition. Did it represent a new competitor, disrupting the existing leagues, or an undue restraint on the market? In this episode, we will be exploring these questions further. Joining me today is my co-host, Matthew Hall. Hi, Matthew.
Hi, Christina. It's good to be back.
Welcome back. So what are we talking about today, and why is it important?
Well, as you mentioned, Christina, we're going to be discussing the competitional implications of the apparently ill-fated Super League proposal. It's often called the European Super League, but it's properly called the Super League. That was its name, or going to be its name. Of course, football or soccer is the world's biggest sport, and the issues raised by this proposal were interesting in their own right, but also do have wider implications for other sports, at least in Europe. So we're going to talk about the background to these issues, what the competition law issues are or were, and also perhaps what might happen in the future.
Great. And who do we have joining us today?
Well, we're very pleased to welcome Dwayne Bach. Dwayne has worked in several law firms where he specialized in sports and esports law. He has also worked for an arbitrator of the Court of Arbitration for Sport in Lausanne. At the moment, he is writing his doctoral thesis titled Limitations in Copyright and Competition Law for Publishers in Esports. Hello, Dwayne.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you very much for coming on. The Super League is, of course, against a particular background of sport as it is set up in Europe, different from the US and other jurisdictions. Could you just, as an introduction, give us a bit of a flavor of those differences and how that works, please?
Sure. So I think the most important difference is that in US sports, you usually play in a closed professional league with no relegation or promotion system. In Europe, the leagues are not operating as closed leagues. So each year, a few clubs get relegated or promoted to another division based on sporting merit. Also, the federations play an important role in European sports as they organize the leagues. In the US, you have a franchise system. So this franchise system can be referred to either as single entity or as joint venture. And federations don't play a big role in US sports. From a European point of view, US amateur sports is also very unique. In the US, amateur sports is usually played in high schools or colleges. In Europe, amateur sports is organized quite differently, especially popular sports such as football, where you would start at a local club instead of a high school. And then you would hope to be discovered by a talent scout of a big football team. I think a good example that shows the overall difference between the two sports systems are the Vegas Golden Knights in the NHL. They're a completely new team, but they immediately started their first season in the NHL. And that would be unthinkable in Europe. Here, when you found a new club, you would have to start in an amateur league and invest much time and money to advance to professional football and ultimately to the first division. And perhaps one last note regarding the club tournaments in Europe. During every season, a club can participate in both national and European competitions. And to compete in the Champions League, a club has to be one of the top teams in the national competitions. So sporting merit plays an important role in European sports, unlike in the US.
Absolutely. So unfortunately, if I wanted to set up a new Premier League team, I couldn't do so and just be allowed into the Premier League in the UK. I would need to actually start right at the bottom and play in a lot of muddy pitches before I could get anywhere near that. That's the background to it. So what was the Super League trying to do by breaking that mold?
Yes, so with the Super League, the organizers intended to turn away from this European system that I described and set up a league based on the US model, a so-called breakaway league. And there were talks for many years regarding such a breakaway league. I think what finally pushed the plans this year was that the clubs found an investor. And this investor is the US investment bank JP Morgan Chase, who was willing to invest several billion euros to establish the Super League. And they did that together with 12 of the wealthiest clubs from Spain, Italy, and England. And they were together responsible for the organization of the league. President of this new league is Florentino Perez, who's also president at Real Madrid. And in the near future, 3 other clubs would have been added and 5 other teams would have been able to qualify for this competition. And altogether, these clubs would have competed in a semi-closed league with no relegation system, just like in the US. But then, of course, as you heard, something happened that, in my opinion, no Super League club anticipated before. The criticism by the media and by the fans was pretty harsh. So the fans, for example, even demonstrated in front of stadiums. And the media coverage was also rather anti-Super League. And not to forget, the UEFA and the national federations threatened to sanction the founding members. So ultimately, this pressure resulted in teams leaving this new league. And right now, there are only 3 teams left. So you can basically say that the Super League is over now before it has even started.
And bizarrely, you even had prime ministers coming out and commenting on football. Were these teams going to remain, Dwayne, as independent entities like they are now? It wasn't going to become a franchise model. Is that right?
The clubs intended to play in the Champions League or in the national competitions and in the Super League. But of course, UEFA and the national federations had other plans.
Yeah. So it ran into problems, as you say, fans demonstrating, prime ministers coming out and commenting. So is it relevant anymore, or are we just having a purely academic discussion today about this?
I think these problems are still relevant because the same issues that are connected to the Super League also arise in other sports, such as basketball, for example. There you have a dispute between the International Basketball Association, FIBA, and EuroLeague Basketball, a private company who organizes European basketball tournaments. And the same issue also arises in European American football, where you used only to have leagues organized by federations. And now with the European League of Football, you have a close European American Football League. So it's still worth talking about these issues for sure.
Okay. I mean, I guess those sports are obviously far less valuable and high profile in Europe, but as you say, the same issues will, in principle, could arise. So what you continue with the story, please. UEFA made various threats, and what were those threats, and what issues did those begin to bring out?
So the UEFA and other national federations issued a joint statement. And I've got the statement in front of me so I can read to you the most important part. It says, the clubs concerned will be banned from playing in any other competition at domestic, European, or world level, and their players could be denied the opportunity to represent their national teams. And indeed, sanctions are possible if you look at Article 49 UEFA statutes, which states that the UEFA shall have the sole jurisdiction to organize or abolish international competitions in Europe that include member federations and clubs. But to me, that sounds a lot like the restriction of competition and affecting the market. And as you probably know, federations can be considered as having a dominant position. So a violation of Article 102 TFEU can be considered. Additionally, the joint statement shows that any measure would be enforced by all federations together. So Article 101 TFEU would also be affected. And by the way, in the US, collective bargaining agreements are very popular to ensure an extensive exemption from the application of competition law. In Europe, there isn't even a legal basis for a European bargaining agreement. And there's also no other exception for sports law cases. So EU competition law applies without any restriction to sports law cases.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of interesting points there, Dwayne. The comment from UEFA referring both to the clubs and the players. You referred also to specific exemptions in the US for some of the leagues. And just you referred there to two particular provisions of the basic European Treaty 101, which of course bans anti-competitive agreements subject to exemptions from the ban, and 102, which bans abuse of a dominant position in the EU. So that's the basic position. You know, sports is obviously special, however. There needs to be some coordination in order to produce, a basic competition in the sporting sense. So, despite those potential issues under 101 and 102, is there a kind of justification that they could have put forward, UEFA, for that position they took?
Yes, so these measures wouldn't constitute a violation if they would pursue a legitimate objective, would be inherent to these objectives, and necessary and proportionate. But in this regard, you would have first to distinguish between the measures against the clubs and against the players.
Okay, so let's look at the clubs. What could UEFA have said with regard to banning the clubs from, as you said, playing in any other competition at domestic, European, or world level? Pretty sweeping statement there.
Yes, so let's first look at the legitimate objectives. The federations argue that they want to preserve the integrity of sports and the competitive balance. Both would be harmed by closed leagues that don't take sporting merit into account. And in fact, they have a valid argument, because if you consider that the gap between poor and rich clubs is already pretty large, then a Super League would worsen the gap by paying the founding clubs allegedly 200 to 300 million euros in the first season. Therefore, the objectives can be classified as legitimate. And the measures are also necessary because they prevent the clubs from negatively affecting the national competitions or the European competitions. But when we shift to the proportionality, then it has to be said that these measures are very, very strict. They limit the market enormously because the founding clubs couldn't play in any competition organized by the UEFA or the national federations. And it's really not easy to classify such a harsh restriction as overall proportionate. As there is no precedent case, however, it's not foreseeable how the courts would decide. I saw that in this regard, some name the ICU decision of the European General Court as precedent. However, this decision did not concern companies such as football clubs, but rather individual athletes. So in my opinion, the ruling cannot serve as precedent here. But if we would look at UEFA's measures against the players, then the ISU decision could be really interesting.
Okay, well, let's dig a bit more into that. As you say, the ISU judgment up from December 2020 from the European General Court concerning, I think, lifetime bans against ice skaters who wanted to join another league. Clearly, as you say, it related to athletes, not teams. And obviously, as well, ice skating is not exactly football or soccer in terms of the financial situation, but equally, it was a kind of non-compete provision that the ISU there was trying to implement, similarly to UEFA. So, can you dig into that case a bit more for us and look whether it really could be relevant?
Yes, sure. So in this case, two Dutch speed skaters challenged the compatibility of the International Skating Union's eligibility rules with EU competition law. These skaters wanted to participate in an event in Dubai organized by a company called Ice Derby. However, this event wasn't authorized by the ISU, and therefore, according to the rules, the skaters would have the threat of a lifetime ban if they would have had competed in this unauthorized tournament. Therefore, the European General Court found that the rules did breach EU competition law. So we could say that due to this decision, the Football Federation's planned restriction in the Super League case against the players can't be justified. But I think that would be too hasty because you have to take the specific facts of the ISU case into account. The decision is based on the fact that there are very limited opportunities for professional speed skaters to earn money with their sport. So these athletes depend on participating in as many tournaments as they can. Professional football players are clearly in a far better economic situation. And another difference would be that the UEFA and the other federations didn't speak about a lifetime ban, but exactly such a sanction was part of the ISU decision. So in my opinion, this decision can't be transferred directly, but I also have to admit that it at least indicates how a court could analyze bans against players. So in my opinion, courts would rather classify bans against players as anti-competitive if they constitute a lifetime ban.
Okay, thanks. So that's the ISU decision. Dwayne, as you say, it provides at least, we would hope, or provides at least some guidance, although clearly, as we're saying, it's a pretty different sport and a different type of ban. Let's look at the other side of the coin now. We've been talking about potential issues for UEFA with its wide statement that it brought out, I think, on the very day that the Super League was proposed. They worked on a Sunday to get that comment out, maybe without taking a lot of advice. But what about the Super League itself? Boris Johnson, the UK Prime Minister, came out again, probably without having taken a lot of advice, and called it a cartel. What do you think about the Super League? A bunch of independent clubs getting together. Is that a cartel?
That's a very interesting point that wasn't discussed too broadly in the media. Let me give you a quick example that might illustrate why the Super League, with its founding members, might violate competition law. So in Spain, in the last 15 years, Barcelona, Real Madrid, or Atletico Madrid always won the league title. Sometimes, however, there are other teams who can make the title race more exciting for the consumer. And this year, Sevilla had a small but realistic chance to win the title as well. The team's total market value of Atletico Madrid, Real Madrid, and Barcelona is over 700 million euros each. Sevilla's market value is about 370 million. So right now, the Spanish clubs that wanted to compete in the Super League have a market value that is twice as high as Sevilla's. So you can imagine what harm to the competitive balance would be caused by the alleged 200 to 300 million euros that each Super League permanent member would earn in the first season. And I mean, of course, competition law should protect competitors such as a Super League. But if a competitor can immediately influence the market to such an extent so that this competition might actually harm the market, then there might be a violation of competition law. But that's a very, very difficult topic, and it's certainly something that a court would have to look at. Another aspect is that the Super League would function as a semi-closed league without focusing on sporting merit, which is pretty rare in Europe, as I described in the beginning. And therefore, some consider the EU Commission's MasterCard case as a precedent. In this decision, the Commission classified high bank fees to be in violation of EU competition law because they were not necessary for credit cards to work effectively and just increased consumer prices. So transferred to the Super League, some argue that this closed model isn't necessary for the league to function effectively. So the model itself might constitute a competition law violation. So I'm not sure if this decision can simply be transferred to sports law cases, but again, it's something that the courts would have to look at for sure.
For sure, as you say. And I think there is actually a case which originated in Spain out of the Super League proposal where the Madrid Commercial Court has now asked the European courts in Luxembourg to take a look at some of these issues in the context of an injunction against the Super League. So that is going to be a very interesting decision or judgment when it comes out from the European courts, and it should help us with some further guidance there. What do you think about the future, both generally in terms of breakaway leagues, or are we just going to have to wait for the European Court to give its view on that? Do you think things are going to happen again? And also, what about the Super League itself? You mentioned there are 3 clubs remaining. Why? It seems that there's nothing. They're not going to play each other every week, presumably. Even that would get a bit boring. But so what's going on there?
So to your first question, I think there will be no attempt to establish such a league in the near future because the reactions by fans and the media was just too negative. Maybe in the long term, in 10 or 15 years, we'll see another attempt because you can't forget that European football is just really attractive for foreign investors, but that would be an issue in the long term. And regarding your second question, the media speculates that the reason behind the clubs, the 3 clubs that are still in the Super League, could be money, because the contract every Super League club had to sign includes a clause that provides for a compensation that has to be paid by every club that leaves the league. But I think what's really interesting right now from a competition law perspective is that case that you name. So the judge in Madrid submitted several questions to the European Court of Justice in the context of Article 267 TFEU. And there the judge asks, for example, if the planned measures by the UEFA and the federations and Article 49 UEFA statutes that I named before violate competition law. So, as you said, it's a very important competition law case that's on the horizon right now.
As you say, it certainly is. And I think we'll see what happens with those clubs. But I think, as you say, they've been chipping away at this type of thing for a long time. They're trying to. They made their big decision to kick it off, so to speak. And I imagine that they're probably going to come back at some point, it would seem to me.
So even though the Super League may be dead, the legal debate is well and alive. So we'll stay tuned. Dwayne, thank you for your time today. But before we let you go, we do ask all of our guests a few questions so we get to know you a little bit better. The first is to tell us something about yourself that we wouldn't know about you if we only knew you professionally.
Okay, so what might be interesting is that I used to play in a band during high school. We played some rock music, but unfortunately after high school we split up, and I still have 2 guitars in my living room, but unfortunately I don't have the time that I used to have at high school. So sometimes I still play them.
Not unlike too many other bands in terms of breaking up after a short stint. And what advice, Dwayne, do you have for law school students or younger lawyers, younger professionals looking to do what you do?
I think one of the most important things is to establish your own network. You can do that, for example, by doing internships or attending legal conferences. And the other thing would be to stay visible by publishing as many articles and blog posts as you can. And I know that can be hard work, but in the end it pays off and it opens doors for new opportunities. I mean, in the end, it's also one of the reasons why I'm on this podcast. So never underestimate yourself, even if you are still at law school.
And I know, Dwayne, you are an active blogger, so we will have to link to one of your blogs. So now this is our last segment, what we call the Curious Hat.
And now it's time for the Curious Hat.
So, Dwayne, I'm going to ask you to pick a number 1 through 25.
Let's go with 11.
11. Hopefully this is not lost across the pond, but what is your favorite Disney character?
Oh, that's not easy. I would go with Tarzan, just because it was the first movie that I went to the cinema. I went there with my father. I was about 5 or 6 years old back then, and I rewatched it many times. I really enjoyed that movie, and the soundtrack by Phil Collins is it's amazing. Mm-hmm. I think maybe it's the best Disney soundtrack of all time.
It's an oldie and a goodie, and certainly one that I think is overdue for a revamp or a refresh. So maybe in a couple of years we'll see yet another Tarzan. Well, Dwayne, again, thank you for your time today, and to our listenership, thanks for listening to this episode of Our Curious Amalgam.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.